joining me in Emkan Futures podcast. Antonio, can you tell our audience why did you get into strategic foresight?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Modafar, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here and to participate and try to share a little bit my experience in foresight and scenarios. Well, I started 20 years ago. I'm an economist. I'm a trained economist. And then I've worked for a big multinational company. And then I had a scholarship to study at the College of Europe, which is a very interesting institution that mainly prepares some European leaders of the future. It's a master's degree, only focus on master's degree. So I did my European economics master there. And I had my first course on foresight and scenarios there. So I had an active course. This was maybe 1999, 2000, something like that. So that was my first, let's say, contact after my training as an economist with foresight and scenarios. And then I really enjoyed, but I didn't know I would dedicate my life to the field. So then after working in Brussels and at European institutions, I came back to Portugal, and I had a career linked to the government. And there, a little bit by chance, but also because I also already had this experience with scenarios and foresight, I started working, researching, and as a practitioner and as a researcher in foresight and scenarios for many years, public policy, etc. And also starting the link with university as an adjunct professor and also executive training, etc. And I became, passionate. I did my PhD also in the field, and that's it. And then as a consultant, as a researcher, as a professor, and that's it. Always linking the tools and the language and the practice of foresight with strategy and innovation. That was also always, let's say, a primary concern of mine.
Excellent. Impressive, background and experience. But do you know, Antonio, that most organizations, when they speak or think about the future, mainly it falls into general guidelines where they start by scanning the trends, what is happening there, then trying to making sense of what does it mean for them, for their future, and trying to develop some actions. From your experience and engagement with different organizations, how do you see the best approach to implement this way of thinking? Tell us more what you saw working, and what is the best practice in this field?
Okay, well, it's a difficult question, of course, but there are many frameworks that different authors, different consultants, etc., propose to introduce foresight in organizations. They mostly have 3 or 4 parts that are common. The first part of preparation, definition of the problem, of the question, of the focal issue. Also thinking in terms of far away to the future we want to think and prepare for, and this depends also on the kind of company, the kind of organization that we are dealing with. Then there's a second part that, as you mentioned, about scanning and looking for drivers of change, trends, uncertainties, wildcards, emergent issues, etc. Then I would say a third part that is more about organizing all these scanning components, and you can do that through scenarios or other ways of organizing this information. and then a connection with strategy and monitoring. So these are very generic, let's say, steps. Of course, you can do this. Most of the times you do parts of this, and you do this with different levels of depth. You don't have all the time in the world and all the resources of the world to implement all this in a very, structured way most of the time. So I would say that, of course, you need to know these frameworks, you need to know the methodologies, how to do it, you need to know the platforms, but you need to know the company, the organization, the team that will be using this. So I would say that probably one of the most important things is to pick and design the right instruments, and design the right processes, considering the already ongoing planning, decision making, and strategy definition process of the organization, and start, introducing more foresight related practices and gaining quick wins inside the organization. So then you can expand for more, let's say, formal, if needed, the future foresight and practice. So, and sometimes it's just to make small changes in the way, for instance, the organization already scans, and for instance, you can work with the marketing department and pick their trends, and with their trends do some implications, options, and foresight oriented work. Or you can work with the strategy department and, okay, now let's develop an alternative strategy if there's a disruption or if a new scenario develops. So I think it's very key to empower the ongoing internal stakeholders with new tools that are foresight and features related, instead of just saying, I will simplify, but just saying, okay, what you do, the advisors, the strategy department, is wrong. This is the wrong way of doing. This is the way you should do. I think that's a mistake. I think you should do if you want to develop this foresight component on an organization is to understand and to co-design with the internal teams to how to reinforce, how to make it more future resilient and certainty resilient, the ongoing planning and decision-making process.
Excellent, Antonio. And I want just to pick on something that you mentioned, which is the importance of understanding the context and the culture of each organization. Because I think it's different. You cannot like take a ready-made or off-the-shelf, certain approach or tools and implement it right away in all organization. You have to be like aware about the context and the culture. And Antonio, I know that you have been working with here in the region, especially in Dubai. How did you see the difference in the culture affecting what you have been doing here within different organizations? How is different than Europe? I believe you have been doing work also in Africa, if I am not mistaken. How the difference of the culture affected the implementation or the different engagement with different corporates or government entities?
Yes, well, cultural issues are all a little bit difficult to address, but maybe that reality better than me, of course. But I will share some ideas. So the first idea, I think it's Dubai, Abu Dhabi, all the Emirates. I really think have a really features-oriented culture. So you are most leaders, I would say, and even middle management, they are very much aware of the need to think long-term and to prepare for the future. And I think that's also a little bit because your future. So you understand there's a change of paradigm. in terms of economic development that you've been through. So it started with energy, you know, mostly energy focused economy, diversified a lot, and diversified also because you were able to develop a common idea what the future, kind of future we will try to pursue, considering where the international economy is going and where we are in the world. So because we are not alone, we cannot, no one is able to achieve, you know, the things by itself. We define our ambitions in a specific context. And so I think I was really impressed by how the most people with whom I clearly have this idea that it's really crucial to prepare now and to make the options now for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You have many, let's say, long-term frameworks that give also this impulse both in the public sector and for the private sector. You have this traditional idea. Also, there's this culture, both the culture, for instance, of city development that is very important, logistics, but also the culture of the energy sector is a long-term culture. Since the first, investment, when you decide to study a potential new site, until that site, starts providing you with a profit, usually it's a very long-term process. So there's this culture, I would say, in the region, and this understanding and this experience of the importance of starting now to anticipate the future, and many experiences now with technology, with the space program, with the Dubai 2020, with all these big projects that announce the future. And of course, the difference, say, to Europe, that I think that one of the differences is that I would say that there's a much clearer idea that the future in the region depends mostly on this capacity to design the future. Here in Europe, this idea is much, I would say, it's not that understood, and it's not that evident as it is, I would say, for instance, in the Emirates.
Excellent. I think this is an excellent point, Antonio, that I think there is the urgency here in the region, and the fact that a lot of the initiatives, as you mentioned, are starting and they are new. Then this appetite for change and to adopting new ideas and new initiatives and to be the first in the world are much higher than different parts where, we have a well-established industries and the practices like in Europe or the state. Taking that into consideration, what is your first advice for any organization or corporate that they want to start implementing a strategic foresight exercise? What is the first thing or the crucial thing that they must start with?
Okay, so it depends a little bit. I would say two things. First, pick a specific challenge. So I think, nowadays we need to do two things at the same time. So we need to prepare ourselves, so training, building a future literacy, a common literacy about the future. So you need training, you need people to get ready, you need to present some good examples and possibilities, but at the same time, I think you need to start already with a specific challenge where you can show internally that these methodologies and tools can really be useful. So I'll say pick a good challenge, have a champion, a leader that says, the leader doesn't have to be all the time throughout the process, but he has to be in key moments of the process, saying this is important for us, and we will commit ourselves to the conclusions, and we will make the investments, and this is very important for us. So get a leader, have a challenge that you can really be helpful, and build as quickly as possible a featured literacy, meaning a common a language. So when we discuss a problem, we understand what we mean by a trend, or we understand what we mean by an uncertainty. A common language, we can agree or disagree, so we can learn from each other, and also be able to understand there are different ways of doing it, like having like a starting toolbox, let's put it like this, where you can pick some methodologies that are, that showed good results in similar circumstances in order to address that challenge that you want to address. So this is all like a system. So the methodology depends on the challenge, and also the literacy. You don't need to. I'm very, of course you should have a core team inside. Like you should have a core team that is well trained, that promotes this kind of methodology and process. It can be directly working with a CEO or with a board, or it can be within the strategy department, or you can have a foresight department, or even close to the marketing, depends. But of course, then start building this literacy about the future, be part of international networks, that's very important as well, and national networks of foresight, and pick a challenge and start working with that. It can be a very, it can be, for instance, rethinking the off-site annual meeting that you already have, and you propose, okay, let's do a foresight workshop and scenarios in one morning with the board. So you don't change too much, few resources, but you start, preparing and start bringing this language to the organization.
And this is actually an important point, that you integrate the work or the practices of strategic foresight with the already existing system. So if you have like a well-established strategic planning, so it will be good like to integrate it with that practice, not to introduce a whole big new thing to the organization. But to that regard, Antonio, do you feel, or did you see from your experience that there is a difference between the focus and implementation of strategic foresight in the private versus the public sector? Like, what do you see the main differences? We know that the private sector is mainly driven by profit, revenue, market shares, while the government is more about, the well-being, providing service to the customers. How that focus shapes or affects the implementation, the expand of the implementation of strategic foresight in public versus the private sectors?
Yes, well, of course there are differences. There are differences between also within the private sector and within the public sector. It depends a little bit on the challenge, because the public sector can have a challenge that is very, let's say, similar to a private sector challenge. And sometimes you have processes that are in between. So you can have like, imagine an industry-specific process that can be co-promoted by the public sector and the private sector. I already work on this kind of projects. So, of course, there are different perspectives. So when we enter a public-private process, you should always be aware that the kind of goals, we have common goals, but we also have differentiated goals. But this is, okay, a little bit more complex, but just to say that it's not just private versus public. What we could say, but I think it's too simplistic, is say, of course, if you work with the private sector, the long term is shorter, usually. Because as a reference, you cannot forget that you know, you have to show profitability. You have to show. You have to answer towards your shareholders, in a very in a very coherent and sometimes without time. You know, we have to show results very quickly. Sometimes in the public sector, you have the ability to think a little bit, to have more time to prepare yourself. But you know, but this is the traditional answer. But from my experience, it's blurred. So the more, I would say that even if you are thinking 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, you need to have quick wins. You have to show in the first couple, even if you are working in a 3 years project, in the first month, you know, you should have something to show your client. And I really think that's you need to do that independently if you're working with the public or the private sector. But of course, for instance, usually the stakeholder management is much more complex in the public sector. Because when you are working with a company, you know, it's much clearer who decides what, and there's like a much clearer governance. If you are working, for instance, for a city or for a region, or even for an industry, of course, there's this. It's kind of clear which public entity is responsible, but then we understand that there are many other entities, both public and private, that have the power to make decisions that will have an impact on our project. So I would say governance and thinking about our governance is always key, but it's really usually more complex in the public sector than in the private. In the private sector, if you have like a key leader that says this is very important, here are the resources, then it's much easier. Just, you know, then it's like, okay, let's design the process, let's do it, and that's in the public sector. You are always rethinking and renegotiating and the governance process.
Sure, and as you said, like the government, you have like different, or the dynamics of decision making, the stakeholders are more diverse, and while in the private sector you are driven by profit and market share, so the decision, you have like a clear target what you want to achieve. You mentioned during the answer, Antonio, also that to have a quick wins whenever you are implementing like any strategic foresight exercise, to have quick wins, to show the value out of those exercises. But usually the recommendations or what comes out of scenarios of any strategic foresight exercise, it's like it's a long term. It needs like years to manifest and years to see the outcomes on the ground. What is your advice to foresight practitioners, to organizations, on how they can, you know, show the impact or show the value of strategic foresight to the management, to the stakeholders as well?
So I can give you an example. So of course it's long term. We're always talking about long term, but you know, nowadays it depends on the sector. Of course, if you are working, I don't know, in the gaming industry, long term is 1 year. If it's oil and gas, it can be 20, 30, 40. You have Shell, they have 20, 50 years. I think climate change, it can be 50 or 60 years. But generally, especially with the COVID now, you know, the long term is much shorter. It can be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, I would say, as a reference. But let me give you an example of what I mean by quick wins. For instance, one thing that is really incredible is, you know, think about the CEO and how the CEO has to embody the future of the company. So a CEO is asked permanently to talk about the future because of stakeholders, because of shareholders. So he needs to build it needs to have a clear idea, a clear, let's put it, picture of the future of its industry. And what I'm witnessing, and you can see that in many CEOs, is that what is a credible leader now? I don't think a credible leader now is someone that says, I know where we are heading. Okay, that's because, you know, we don't know. We don't know. There's so much uncertainty that the most sectors, we are not sure where we are heading. Let's imagine 1 year ago, and how could we imagine everything that happened in international economy? We were all doing so well, and everything was, you know. So what more and more leaders are doing is to say, this is how I see my industry. This is how I see the contextual evolution, but we are prepared for other possibilities. We are prepared, and this gives credibility. We are prepared for different scenarios. So a quick win, I would say, is being able to provide this, to work with the communication departments, with PR, with Mark, to provide, you know, a narrative for the leaders of the company that is more, let's put it, uncertainty resilient, and that I think more and more is better received by stakeholders in general, being the investors and or other types of stakeholders or shareholders. So this is just an example of, so you can start doing your scanning process, building your team, but already seeing how can you help the PR, or how can you help strategy, how can you help marketing, how can you help the teams that cooperate with the government, providing them with foresight and scenarios and related topics.
Excellent. And Antonio, you mentioned that, you know, that the CEO, of course, he is responsible toward the shareholders, and he have to provide like specific targets. We will be having this market share or achieve this profit rates or something like that. This falls under the narrative of strategic planning. As you know, strategic planning, usually it has been like business as usual. It assumes the business will be, if we are providing, you know, gaming, so we'll, in the future, we'll still providing gaming. But as you mentioned, crucial terms here is uncertainty. But what is your perspective on the urgency of changing these narratives within any organization to accept this element of uncertainty, that this is part of the reality? And it's more crucial now since the rate of disruption, the rate of change is accelerating. So uncertainty is like coming all the way behind every corner, and you know, you cannot anymore plan for like long term actually. It depends on the industry, but the rate of change is changing. What did you see as an expert in the field, like best practices or people doing it right when it comes to changing this narrative, changing this way they look in the future?
Yes, that's I'd say it's a real big challenge. You know, all the human beings, and I would say organizations, we all have our implicit perspective on the future. So we all have an idea, even if you don't think much about how, you know, our strategic context will develop. And especially leaders and people who work in a specific industry, if you ask them, they have it in their heads. Sometimes they don't think too much about that. They just assume that most things will remain constant. So they don't discuss too much the assumptions that these mental models about the future, these expectations, assume. The thing is that sometimes those expectations about the future that people have and decision makers have, they are not, let's say, not, they don't have evidence supporting them already, because it was something. So what we call bringing future-oriented evidence for people, and so bringing future-oriented evidence is very important for the process. We do that through scanning, looking for new changes, analyzing and identifying uncertainties, and then being able to build processes. What I mean is work interviews, build processes that, you know, let's put it like invite key decision makers to explicit, to, you know, to express their perspectives on the future, the way they think about the future. And then if you are able to put those things, you know, smoothly together, and the way we decision makers see the future, you have the perfect conditions for decision makers, for them to start rebuilding their mental models about the future, and understanding that, you know, they need to change now in order to prepare not for unlikely futures, but for plausible futures, for, I would say, even the expected future is not the business as usual. So now I did some research with colleagues, and now what we replace the business as usual scenario with something we call to the best of our knowledge today. So what we do is that now, so often what the future that we expect is completely different from the future that we used to have. So even if you want to build a reference scenario, you should not use the business as usual scenario. You should discuss the kind of change that is already expected, because there's a lot of future-oriented information that you shouldn't ignore, or it's strange to ignore. So, for instance, so this is I would say my answer. So, design a process where you allow people to discover change, and this discovery idea is not just blah blah blah. It's really it's the difference between me sending you a PDF with my research, or me designing a process that has a PDF, the document, the document as an input. But then I design a process where you, the decision maker, finds by yourself the potential for change, the potential for change, and how our organization has to change accordingly. I'm not saying that you shouldn't bring expert knowledge and do talks, and, you know, of course, those are all inputs, but it's always, I think, or most about the people that make the decisions discover, because there's like a haha moment. Okay, now I understand. So if I understand change, so I feel comfortable to lead the needed organizational portfolio investment changes in order to answer that different future.
I know it's hard to explain, you know, especially when it comes, you know, the perspective and the narrative, that I found it always needs more time to go into the nuances of the discussion. But I loved what you said about, you know, trying to have it in a practical way, and trying to, you know, to always try to engage people with you in this journey, and not to depend on like a single source of knowledge, and which might, build into the resistance of change with people. So Antonio, I think we are coming to an end to this interview. One last question: what do you recommend for our audience who are new to strategic foresight? What are the resources or sources of knowledge they can go and find more about the discipline, the tools, the methodologies, maybe examples, scenarios, etc.?
Okay, so well, actually, we are developing. Now we hope to launch it soon. We are developing a certification process with my company, together with Jimmy and Global Innovation Management Institute, that has a strong presence in the Middle East and in Dubai, in the Emirates. So we are developing a future foresight certification process that is really to help, hopefully to help to provide a step-by-step process in order for managers to be able to to be ready to lead and implement and design this kind of methodology. So that's the first, and it's very fresh because we hope to launch it very, very soon. But of course, I can, there are many international institutions that do very interesting future foresight and scenarios work, also in Dubai, for instance, in the Emirates. But I would, for instance, at the European Commission, that I know a little bit better, as the Joint Research Center. OECD also has a team working in a very interesting way with foresight and scenarios. The International Energy Agency, and I'm talking about open sources, International Energy Agency, European Environmental Agency, and then some governments also that are doing very interesting work in this field. And many of these organizations, they have our how-to guides and examples and etc. that can be useful for practitioners to explore. I can also share my favorite book. If you want to buy one book and read one book.
Yes, please.
My favorite book is by an author called Kees van der Eyden. He's a Dutch who worked for Shell. And then he also had an academic career. And he wrote a book that's called Scenarios, the Art of Strategic Conversation. And it's a book that, it's both enjoyable to read and I would say methodologically very sound. And but there are a lot of literature I can also share with you. I have my own writings, but I don't want to recommend too much of what I did.
Anyway, Antonio, I will be sharing your website within the podcast page for the reference for our listeners, so they can go and check it out. Also check your company, the services that you are providing as well. Also, we'll be putting a link for the book that you have mentioned, Amazon link, if it's available there for our audience as well.
Yes, yes.
With that, thank you, Antonio. It was a pleasant and very informative session. Me personally, I benefited a lot. I have been taking some notes that I want for information that I want to check and study further. Thank you, and hopefully we'll have more sessions, more episodes with you in the future.
Thank you, Madafar. It was a real honor to have this conversation with you, and congratulations again for the initiative. And I really hope we can work together and build these new approaches towards the future together. Thank you very much, Madafar. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Anton.